It was a cold, foggy night when Dr. Elizabeth Carter arrived at St. Mary's Hospital for her overnight shift. St. Mary's, an imposing structure with Gothic architecture, loomed against the dark sky, its old stone walls hidden in the thick mist. As she walked through the entrance, the smell of antiseptic mixed with an underlying dampness greeted her, a scent she had grown accustomed to over her years of service. Elizabeth's shift began uneventfully enough. She checked on patients, reviewed charts, and made small talk with the night nurses. Around midnight, the hospital settled into a quiet lull, interrupted only by the occasional beeping of monitors and the distant murmur of voices. The hospital had a reputation among the staff. They believed it was haunted. Whispers of ghostly apparitions, strange noises, and unexplained occurrences were common. Elizabeth, a woman of science, dismissed these tales as superstitions. She had seen enough real horrors in her line of work to be scared of ghosts. Tonight, however, something felt different. There was an oppressive stillness in the air, a silence so profound that it seemed to seep into her bones. The usual sounds of the hospital were muted, almost as if the building itself were holding its breath. At around 2 a.m., Elizabeth received a call from the nurses' station on the 4th floor, the oldest and least used part of the hospital. It was a psychiatric ward, long since shut down after a series of unexplained deaths decades ago. Now it was mostly a storage area, rarely visited by staff. "Dr. Carter, we need you to come to the 4th floor," the nurse on the line said, her voice trembling. "What's wrong?" Elizabeth asked, already sensing the fear in the nurse's voice. There's a patient here, but that ward has been closed for years." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "I'll be right there." She took the stairs, avoiding the slow, creaking elevator that seemed to groan under its own weight. The stairwell was dimly lit, and her footsteps echoed in the confined space. When she reached the 4th floor, she was greeted by a blast of cold air, far colder than any other part of the hospital. The hallways were dark, lit only by a few flickering overhead lights. The old psychiatric ward had been left largely untouched, with peeling wallpaper and rusting metal beds still in some of the rooms. Elizabeth found the nurse, Sarah, standing outside one of the old patient rooms, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Dr. Carter," she whispered, "I swear, there's someone in there." Elizabeth took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The room was dark, but she could make out the shape of a bed in the corner. As she stepped inside, she felt a sudden drop in temperature, and her breath came out in visible puffs. She reached for the light switch, but it didn't work. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice steady, but her heart pounding. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, from the corner of the room, she heard a soft, raspy whisper. "Help me." Elizabeth moved closer, pulling out her flashlight. The beam illuminated the bed, revealing a figure lying there, covered by a thin, tattered blanket. The figure was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow in the darkness. "Who are you?" Elizabeth asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The figure turned its head slowly, fixing its gaze on her. "They won't let me leave," it whispered. Elizabeth felt a surge of fear. This was impossible. This ward had been closed for years. How could someone be here? "Who won't let you leave?" she asked, taking a step back. "They," the figure replied, its voice growing fainter. "The ones who whisper in the dark." Elizabeth turned to Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway. "We need to get him out of here," she said, trying to mask her growing unease. As they approached the bed, the lights flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Elizabeth's flashlight flickered and died, leaving them in pitch black. The temperature dropped even further, and Elizabeth could feel an icy breath on her neck. Then she heard it, a faint whispering, like a chorus of voices just out of earshot. The sound grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the room. She felt something cold brush against her arm, and she spun around, but there was nothing there. "We need to go," she said, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the door. But the door slammed shut in their faces, trapping them inside. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, and Elizabeth could feel them pressing in on her from all sides. "Open the door!" Sarah screamed, pounding on the wood. Elizabeth fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices all around them. She could feel something cold and clammy wrap around her wrist, pulling her back towards the bed. "Let us out," she shouted, struggling against the unseen force. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The door flew open, and they stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Elizabeth didn't have an answer. She looked back at the room, now dark and silent, and felt a shiver run down her spine. Something was very wrong in this hospital. They made their way back to the main part of the hospital, leaving the 4th floor behind. But the sense of unease lingered. Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. For the rest of her shift, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at her. But the hospital was quiet, and the other patients slept peacefully. When her shift finally ended, Elizabeth left the hospital, stepping out into the cold morning air. The fog had lifted, and the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the clouds. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering fear. But as she walked to her car, she heard it again. A faint whisper carried on the wind. She stopped and looked around, but there was no one there. Shaking her head, she got into her car and drove away, trying to convince herself that it was just her imagination. But deep down, she knew that something had awakened in the old psychiatric ward. Something that had been waiting for a long time. And it wasn't going to let her go so easily. Elizabeth spent the next few days trying to put the experience behind her. But the memory of that night haunted her. She found herself distracted, unable to focus on her work. Her colleagues noticed her unease, but she brushed off their concerns, not wanting to seem irrational. Then, one night, she received a call from Sarah. The nurse's voice was trembling with fear. "Dr. Carter, It's happening again." "What do you mean?" Elizabeth asked, her heart sinking. "There's someone on the 4th floor. You need to come quickly." Elizabeth hesitated, fear gripping her, but she knew she couldn't ignore it. "I'm on my way." She drove to the hospital, her mind racing. As she entered the building, she felt a sense of dread settle over her. The hallways seemed darker, the shadows longer and more menacing. When she reached the 4th floor, she found Sarah waiting for her, pale and shaking. "I don't know what to do," the nurse said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I heard the whispers again." Elizabeth took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Show me." They made their way to the same room where they had found the patient before. The door was ajar, and a cold breeze blew out from the dark interior. Elizabeth pushed the door open and shone her flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the sense of unease was palpable. Elizabeth stepped inside, followed closely by Sarah. The temperature dropped immediately, and Elizabeth could see her breath fogging in the air. "Is anyone here?" she called out, her voice echoing in the silence. For a moment, there was no response. Then, from the corner of the room, came a faint whisper. "Help me." Elizabeth turned towards the sound, her flashlight illuminating the empty bed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Help me." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. She moved closer to the bed, her heart pounding. As she reached out to touch the sheets, a cold hand closed around her wrist, pulling her down. She screamed, struggling against the unseen force. Sarah tried to help, but she was pushed back by an invisible barrier. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hand released her, and Elizabeth fell to the floor, gasping for breath. Sarah rushed to her side, helping her up. "Are you okay?" the nurse asked, her voice shaking. Elizabeth nodded, her mind racing. "We need to get out of here." They fled the room, the whispers following them down the hallway. As they reached the stairwell, Elizabeth glanced back and saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway, watching them. They didn't stop until they were back in the main part of the hospital, the whispers finally fading into silence. Elizabeth knew they couldn't ignore this any longer. Something was very wrong in the old psychiatric ward, and they needed to find out what. The next day, Elizabeth called a meeting with the hospital administration to discuss the disturbing occurrences on the 4th floor. She was met with skepticism, but her determination and the evident fear in Sarah's eyes convinced them to at least investigate the matter. "We'll need to review the old records," suggested Dr. Thompson, the hospital's chief of staff. "There might be something in the history of the psychiatric ward that can explain what's happening." The administration agreed to form a small team to look into the issue. Elizabeth, Sarah, Dr. Thompson, and a few other staff members were tasked with digging through the hospital's archives, searching for any clues. The hospital's records room was a dusty, cluttered space in the basement, filled with stacks of yellowing files and old logbooks. As they sifted through the documents, they uncovered a grim history of the psychiatric ward. The ward had been opened in the early 1900s, during a time when mental health treatment was primitive and often brutal. Patients were subjected to harsh treatments, including electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and isolation. Many had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths quietly covered up by the hospital administration of the time. One name kept appearing in the records: Dr. Adrian Hawthorne, the head psychiatrist. Descriptions of him painted a picture of a man obsessed with experimenting on his patients, pushing the boundaries of ethical treatment in the name of science. The records hinted at unsanctioned experiments conducted in secret, often late at night when the hospital was quiet. Elizabeth found a diary belonging to one of the nurses from that era. The entries detailed the increasing unease among the staff, strange noises at night, and sightings of ghostly figures in the hallways. The final entry was particularly chilling. The whispers have started again. Dr. Hawthorne says it's just our imagination, but I fear something terrible is happening. The patients speak of shadows in the corners, voices that call to them. I must get out before it's too late. The team realized that whatever was haunting the fourth floor might be connected to Dr. Hawthorne's experiments. They needed to find out more about him and what he had done to his patients. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. She kept hearing the faint whispers, even in her own home. She decided to return to the hospital and investigate further. She called Sarah and asked her to meet her there. When they arrived, the hospital was eerily quiet. The two women made their way to the fourth floor, carrying flashlights and a sense of dread. The air grew colder as they approached the old psychiatric ward, the oppressive silence pressing in on them. They entered the room where they had first encountered the mysterious figure. The bed was still there, the thin, tattered blanket undisturbed. Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine as she stepped closer, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, hoping for some response. The room remained silent, but then the temperature dropped even further, and the whispers began anew. Elizabeth felt a cold breath on her neck and turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the corner. Its hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul. "Help me," it whispered, the voice filled with anguish. Elizabeth steeled herself. "What do you need? How can we help you?" The figure pointed to a spot on the floor, and Elizabeth noticed a loose floorboard. She knelt down and pried it up. Revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a dusty, leather-bound journal. She opened it, her hands shaking. The pages were filled with Dr. Hawthorne's meticulous handwriting, detailing his experiments and the horrific treatments he had subjected his patients to. The final entry was particularly disturbing. "I have gone too far. The voices won't stop. They are coming for me. I fear what I have unleashed." Elizabeth realized that the spirits of the patients, tormented and abused, were trapped in the hospital, unable to find peace. Dr. Hawthorne's experiments had opened a door to something dark and malevolent. "We need to put these souls to rest," Elizabeth said, her voice firm. "They deserve peace." Sarah nodded, her fear replaced by determination. "What?" Elizabeth thought for a moment. "We need to perform a cleansing ritual. We'll need to gather some supplies. Candles, salt, sage. will also need to say prayers to guide the spirits to the other side. They spent the next few hours gathering what they needed. When they returned to the 4th floor, the air was thick with an oppressive energy. Elizabeth and Sarah set up candles around the room, forming a protective circle. They sprinkled salt along the doorways and windows to keep out any negative energy. As they lit the sage and began to chant the prayers, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The shadowy figure reappeared, watching them from the corner. Elizabeth focused on the ritual, pouring all her energy into guiding the spirits towards the light. The room grew colder, and the whispers turned into anguished cries. Elizabeth felt a force pushing against her, trying to break her concentration. She held firm, her voice steady and strong. "Rest in peace," she whispered, feeling a tear roll down her cheek. "You are free now." Slowly, the cries began to fade, and the room grew warmer. The shadowy figure dissolved into the air, and the oppressive energy lifted. The candles flickered out, leaving them in a peaceful silence. Elizabeth and Sarah sat in the quiet room, feeling a sense of relief wash over them. They knew they had done the right thing, helping the tormented souls find peace. As they left the hospital that night, Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The whispers were gone, and the oppressive feeling had lifted. She knew that the spirits of the old psychiatric ward had finally found their rest. In the days that followed, the hospital staff noticed a change. The atmosphere felt lighter, the oppressive energy gone. Elizabeth continued her work, but she never forgot the events of those nights. She knew that the past could never be fully erased, but at least the spirits of St. Mary's Hospital had found their peace. Elizabeth and Sarah's bravery did not go unnoticed. The hospital administration commended them for their dedication and courage. But more than that, they felt a deeper sense of connection to their work and to the patients they served. The legend of the haunted 4th floor faded over time, becoming just another ghost story. But Elizabeth and Sarah knew the truth. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, bringing light to the shadows of St. Mary's Hospital. And they vowed to never forget the lessons they had learned about compassion, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Years passed, and Elizabeth continued to work at St. Mary's Hospital, now one of the most respected doctors on staff. She and Sarah remained close friends, bound together by their shared experience. They would occasionally visit the 4th floor, now sealed off and designated as a memorial to the patients who had suffered there. One day, a new nurse asked Elizabeth about the stories of the haunted ward. Elizabeth smiled, her eyes distant. "There are things that happen in this world that we can't always explain," she said. "But sometimes the most important thing we can do is to listen and to help those who can't help themselves." The hospital continued to thrive, and the memory of Dr. Adrian Hawthorne and his cruel experiments faded into history. But Elizabeth knew that the past was always with them, a reminder of the power of compassion and the need for vigilance against the darkness. And though the whispers had ceased, Elizabeth could still feel the presence of the spirits she had helped to free. They were no longer trapped, but their stories lived on in the walls of St. Mary's, a testament to the resilience of the human soul. Elizabeth stood in the hallway, looking down at the floor where she had uncovered Dr. Hawthorne's journal. She felt a sense of peace, knowing that she had played a part in bringing light to the shadows. She whispered a quiet prayer of thanks, then turned and walked away, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that she was never truly alone.